For this misconceptions video, I'll be talking about something a little bit more advanced, specifically about RAM speed and timings, as well as cache latency, and a couple of misconceptions I've seen thrown around about them. So stay tuned. For the purpose of this video, I'll be talking specifically about DDR4, but everything applies to other DDRs as well, DDR3, DDR2, but I'll be talking about DDR4. For DDR4 RAM, the minimum speed is 2133 megahertz, and that's the base speed that you can attain without overclocking. Now, for any other speed, in order to attain that speed, you will have to enable XMP in your motherboard BIOS, which will enable the motherboard to overclock the memory controller on the CPU to allow the memory to be run at higher speeds. Now, of course, the RAM itself needs to be rated for higher speed performance, and that's why you'll see varying speeds of RAM when buying one from 2133 all the way up to 4000 plus. So there is a price cost associated with higher speed RAM, in both that you have to buy a motherboard that supports XMP overclocking, as well as buy the RAM that supports the speed that you want. However, there are other factors that come into play when it comes to memory performance. Another factor, for example, could be RAM timings. Now, RAM timings are a set of 4 numbers that basically says how long does it take for memory to respond, or how quickly can something be read from memory. Now, these numbers will often appear on product specification pages with little to no details or any kind of explanation to what they mean. The first number is usually the most important, and that's cache latency, and you may have heard of this before. Basically, what cache latency is the number of cycles it takes for memory to be read from the specific area. Obviously, it's a bit more complicated than that, but generally speaking, that's what it means. Now, notice I said the number of cycles. Cache latency is not a unit in seconds or milliseconds or even nanoseconds. It's a unit based on the number of cycles that it takes for the memory to be read. Now, as I mentioned before, RAM speed is in megahertz or cycles, which means that cache latency and RAM speeds are actually interrelated, that the higher the RAM speed, usually the higher the cache latency. And this doesn't mean that, for example, if you have 3200 megahertz 16 cache latency RAM compared to 3000 megahertz 15 cache latency RAM, that the 3000 megahertz RAM will be slower but respond quicker. It actually responds at the exact same rate or the exact same speed as the 16 cache latency 3200 megahertz RAM when you're talking about seconds. When you consider RAM timings, you have to divide the RAM timing as listed by cache latency by the RAM speed that it operates at. So for example, 15 cache latency divided by 3000 megahertz is actually the exact same as 16 cache latency divided by 3200 megahertz. And therefore, these two sticks of RAM would actually respond at the exact same time in terms of nanoseconds. So I've talked a lot about RAM speed and timings. What do you need? What RAM speeds do you need? What RAM timings do you need? Is it worth to pay, exorbitant amounts of money for faster RAM? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on what you're doing. For very, very CPU intensive applications, for example, like CPU animation, CPU rendering, etc., faster RAM will help significantly. For example, I tested 2133 megahertz RAM in Cinebench versus 3000 megahertz RAM in Cinebench, and the 3000 megahertz RAM just from the higher RAM speed got a 5.9% improvement in Cinebench score. So if you're constantly doing applications that are similar to Cinebench, then having faster RAM will help significantly. As for RAM timings and cache latency specifically, a lot of RAM doesn't give you that many options when it comes to cache latency. Pretty much every 3000 megahertz RAM will have between 15 to 16 or maybe 17 cache latency at worst. You're not really going to have to choose between 10 cache latency versus 20 cache latency. It's going to be a difference of 1 or 2, and at that point it's really insignificant and not noticeable. I didn't really notice any difference in performance when I manually changed my timings of RAM in BIOS and did different benchmarks. I pretty much got the exact same score. Obviously, if you have 2 identical kits of RAM at the exact same price, everything else is the same, then sure, pick the one with the lower timings, but everything else is just kind of not relevant. I would recommend something around 3000 megahertz RAM if you do care about RAM speed. This is because Difference in price from 2133 to 3000 is very little, maybe $10 to $20, but the jump from 3000 or maybe 3200 megahertz to 36 or even higher is significant. For me, at least in my country, 3600 megahertz RAM costs $50 more than 3200 megahertz, and a difference of 400 megahertz at that point does not justify a $50 increase. So you should not pursue something like 4000 megahertz RAM. It's just a waste of money at that point. You might as well look into overclocking your CPU, for example, or getting a faster processor, because those would be much better investment for your money. Alright, that about sums up this video. If you liked it, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And thank you for watching, and have a great day.